ready to get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Kate Goldstein. I'm a Senior Vice President at SSI Strategy, and I'm excited to be here today with my colleagues, Benit Maru and Yuri Maricich. This will be the first of a series of conversations around navigating drug development. So probably everyone who joined today is well aware of all of the macro changes that have been impacting life sciences over the last decade or so. We've seen changes in the funding landscape, massive geopolitical changes, increased scrutiny from regulators around clinical data, just to name a few. We'll talk about them more. And we also talk about how this is really coupled with the almost paradoxical increased pressure from investors to truncate development timelines to reach the next value inflection point as quickly as possible. So obviously it's tricky and it's complicated, but at SSI we've helped hundreds of organizations navigate this complexity over the last decade or so. So the goal of today's conversation is to share what we're doing in practice to reduce risk in the development cycle, despite the increased risks in the macro environment. So this is intended to be a high-level discussion. In subsequent sessions, we'll do a deeper dive into some of the specific areas that we mentioned today. Before we jump in, though, Benit, Yuri, if you could each give a quick intro.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. Hi, everybody. So I'm Benit Maru. I am an adult neurologist by training. And for the past several years, I have been working with SSI, supporting our clients in the early development phase, whether it be a small biotech or ATMP or devices, but also working as an acting chief medical officer, with our team, helping with funding environments with raises, and also actually working with investors to help them decide which asset they should choose or not as well. So, Yuri?
Great. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. As was mentioned, my name is Yuri Maricich. I'm an internal medicine physician. I have a bit of a unique blend of clinical practice, biotech, as well as digital health experience and expertise. I've worked as part of organizations developing small molecules, gene therapy, and RNAs across immunology, neurology, oncology, and neuropsychiatry space. Most recently, my last full-time chief medical officer role was at Pear Therapeutics, and I've worked with organizations going from concept all the way up through commercialization. And similar, I think, and a vein you'll hear throughout this discussion is around helping support teams raising financing, and been involved from seed all the way up to public offerings, and also have a venture partner role for a corporate venture firm. Back to you, Kate.
Great. So one last thing to note, we'll spend the latter half of our time today doing Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go, please pop them in the chat. We'll be monitoring and we'll address towards the end. So let's get to it. I briefly touched on broad industry changes. Just to ground the group, give us a bit more color. What is going on?
Sure. I'll crack on, I guess, and take a first stab at that. I think, that there has been a significant change in the funding landscape over the last 3-4 years. So if you go back, 5-6 years in the heyday, I say heyday in air quotes, around gene therapy as well in particular, there were products that were coming, there was great successes that were seen, the transformation in SMA from an antisense oligonucleotide to gene therapy, things were looking good, things were looking up. And at that time, the world started to come back around, AAV therapy and other unique ATMPs. Unfortunately, safety concerns were seen in other programs, in high-dose systemic gene therapy, for example. There were some patient deaths. And there was some, negative connotations there. Then we obviously had a downturn, global downturn, and a pandemic. Coupled all of that together, the investing environment just bottomed out in a way. And then there was it was harder to raise funds. I mean, it is starting to pick up slowly now, in our opinion. But I think that's probably one of the bigger macro landscape changes, that I would point to initially.
Yep. And Yuri, how does that impact your work? You've been, as you mentioned, sort of on both sides. You're on the venture side as well as within a biotech. So how does that align with what you're seeing?
Sure, it's a fascinating question, because I think we're at a stage right now where the complexity facing companies and the complexity facing leaderships, particularly those responsible for helping achieve those milestones, especially in the medical office, are probably the greatest they've been in my memory. We have, I think, as Bennett mentioned, a completely transformed financing environment. We have greater number of stakeholders that we need to address and meet, and the differences across those stakeholders are quite diverse. We have a higher bar for like evidence needs, and that includes those milestones that are inflection points for financing. And this is being done at the same time when there's an exploding number of types of or modalities of what is a medicine. And so in many of these novel modalities, what used to suffice, such as safety data, is no longer sufficient. And I think the challenge this places in having to be more focused, more resource efficient is also challenged because the investors now, we have, and I'll use the we there, but also on the other side, investors, when you're working on the biotech side, have more options because there is a broader need for cash and resources. And so it's not just, can a company execute, but does this company rise to the top of the list of investment opportunities? And so it's essentially a buyer's market for investors, and they can be much more selective. So then as an organization, how do you differentiate yourself? How do you have strategies to achieve those milestones that are going to be compelling and put you at the top of that list?
Yep. I mean, we're increasingly being asked to do more with less. And so in my mind, really the only way to do that well is by having a solid, well thought out, aligned strategy and plan. And that's really sort of the core of how we operate. So I know at SSI, we often talk about the importance of planning with the end in mind. And that's really one of our core risk mitigation strategies that we put forward. But Bennett, so what does that actually mean? And what does that look like in practice?
I think in practice it kind of varies, but I think, for me and, most of our colleagues, us here as well, the end in mind to me is actually the patient. We're, as clinicians, as people in the life sciences industry, for us, it is about, if this product, therapy, whatever it may be, actually does do something which is transformative, or potentially transformative in a patient's life, that to me is the end. Now, work backwards from there. Now, to Yuri's point earlier, it is a buyer's market. So, the investor is going to have a slightly different mindset. It depends on which stage they come in, right, Yuri, in terms of funding as well, because some investors are not going to take you through the entirety of that transition, from seed to IPO, whatever it may be. But understanding the need of those, their end in mind is probably different. But from our perspective, the end in mind is, you should think about it from patient and patient access.
Yuri, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, maybe to just build on it, because I very much agree with Bennett here. And I think the end in mind for many biotechs, including those that I've been part of, in an effort to focus, there is oftentimes a singular drive around achieving regulatory approval. And that's understandable, and it's not inappropriate, but the problem is, I don't think in today's environment you can solely focus on regulatory approval. You have to also be thinking about commercialization from the very beginning, in terms of what's your commercial assessment, what's the patient population, how do you show what are going to be drivers of value, how are you going to differentiate yourself in the competitive treatment landscape? Because investors are thinking about those things, but also organizations that are thinking broadly will then build in what are different milestones to tick off those criteria as they work through those different threads. So I really see them as like two major development pathways. One is what is necessary to achieve regulatory approval, but what is also necessary to achieve clear definition or definers of commercial potential success, so that upon achieving those, then you're going to have the resources to scale that. And this is in an environment where there is now continued downward pressure on reimbursement. It's been there for quite some time globally, but in the US with the IRA and other aspects of scrutiny, we're seeing more demands on companies to have to differentiate their products. And so those milestones are there. And as Benit and I talk a lot about, those milestones also are moving. So the goalposts are no longer what they were previously in our careers.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Benit.
So yeah, just to add to that as well. So I completely agree with Yuri. The plan ultimately with the end in mind is that, but developing a plan, which is a stepwise approach to achieve that is kind of the way to go, which then does include, the commercial aspect. But don't also, people should be, in my mind, people should be thinking about this even if they're at the preclinical stage. It's never too early to think this through, because the goalposts are shifting, but actually being able to have a plan that you can demonstrate in front of a future investor is actually important, because it's not just pie in the sky thinking then, right? These are the steps that we want to take. How we get there, will depend obviously on data and things like that, but it does behoove people to actually think that piece through, and think about those smaller milestones, which should actually get you to that much larger milestone.
And Benit, I think here, from an operational perspective, I think one of the challenges then is how do you take that strategic framing and reduce it to kind of the operational elements that allow you to execute on that. And that's where I think there's a greater need for teams that can be flexible. You need to be able to have a team that can articulate a well-defined, operationally practical plan, but also be sufficiently agile that as new information comes in, then the team's going to change over time. And that also includes new information around financing or resource definition. Okay, we have a lower budget than we expected when we set out on this. How do we accommodate for that? Speed, I think, becomes increasingly important. And sometimes, while we also are operating in a resource-constrained environment, sometimes time is more valuable than money. And so then how do you set up programs to be able to operate that? And when do you determine those trade-offs need to be made between conserving resources or going really, really fast?
Yeah. I mean, if I'm thinking about the organizations where I've seen this type of planning done really well, it's when, it doesn't live and die on the shelf and just sit in PowerPoint, but it actually becomes a living tool that we first use to really drive alignment across all of these cross-functional stakeholders and functions. Then we track against it. We put the governance and the program management in place to see, how are we doing against the plan? And then, Yuri, to your point, we're able to regularly take stock of the internal and external changes in our assumptions, our budget, our timeline, and then it sort of creates the ability to be more agile because we know what we're working with.
Yeah, and it's an iterative process, right? It's a living and breathing document, and think about it from a, like a CDP, a clinical development plan, for example. Clinical development cannot be static. It has to kind of move, in terms of what's happening from the regulatory side, what's happening, from the competitive side. A CDP is an iterative process. So this plan should be considered in the same vein. Like if you're thinking of an analog, it has to be a living, breathing document, which you would then adapt to meet the circumstances and the needs as well. So, I mean, look, I think everything we're saying, and even just to this point at the moment, it sounds simple and it's like, well, of course I know this, it makes, it's logical. But to Yuri's point, there's high pressure. Sometimes time is actually more important, right, than a resource. When you're in these high pressure situations, everything goes out the window, not just for myself, the groups that we've supported, it is the way it is, unfortunately. So sometimes the stating the obvious is needed and is important, and kind of just grounding yourself, because it is a fluid environment and it's usually high pressure as well, Yuri.
Yeah, and I want to underscore this. I mean, I think one of the key things I've seen in examples of like successful teams, and would appreciate your comment on this, Benit, as well, Kate, is the need, particularly for the medical office and those who are executing on the development plan, to also be translators, because there are so many stakeholders that one has to take in those inputs for that plan and that agility. It's not just like one's own management team that one's part of or one's own peers within an organization, and then be able to provide back that information to help bring those stakeholders along, when oftentimes people speak, very different types of languages. And obviously we're not just speaking about different actual languages, but the types of ways they think about problems, approach problems, understand data, what they value, can be very different depending on who those stakeholders are.
Yeah, I agree. I'm smiling just because, past experience, current lived experience as well. And it's just more, you're kind of expected to work, in the medical office, whether it be a CMO or, head of development. You're meant to wear multiple hats, and sometimes you're not trained for them. And sometimes it's just kind of you learn by experience. Sorry, I should say. I think one of the biggest things in that sense as well is there is so much that is expected of you, especially in an R&D function within the biotechs. You should never be afraid to ask other people for opinions, whoever it may be, right? Ask for help. If you don't know, say you don't know. Don't try and wing it. I think that's kind of a hard lesson for some people to learn as well. Coming like people that have come straight from academia or practice, and then they go into the commercial world, they're completely different beasts. And this again then goes to stakeholder management as well, right? To your point, Yuri, how your conversation would be with a peer, as a medic, would be very different to how it would be, if you were speaking to somebody that was doing supply chain, for example. But everybody needs to know certain parts of information which are pertinent, to not just raise morale, make sure you're all singing from the same hymn sheet, but you want people to come with you on the journey. So there is that morale component from a company perspective with your colleagues. There's that external stakeholder management piece from an investor piece. So all these different narratives, to your point, need to come through. How are you then speaking about them, and how does that team gel together ultimately? And I think that's just something I think it's appreciated. I just think it's underthought sometimes.
Yeah, well, ultimately, we need to create a common language by which our entire team is operating and, looking at the same assumptions. I wanted to shift gears just a little bit for the sake of time, and do a bit of a deeper dive into some of the subcomponents that would inform the planning and the considerations that we're looking at there. So I know we do have a visual aid, if we can bring that up. All right, here it comes. So obviously this is a high level slide, but there is a lot here. And as I said, we'll be doing a deeper dive into some of these areas in future sessions. But I think it would be good, Benit, if you could just kind of start talking us through really the quick and dirty about what are the major things that we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, so I guess, Yuri's point was initially at the beginning, people start with regulatory, but you should be thinking about everything. But, I'm going to start with regulatory. So apologies. But the main thing is, if you're at that non-clinical stage, how can you get into the human? So what you do need to think about is you need to think about which jurisdiction you're going to, where do you want to go first, what level of data is required for you to actually, start that study. You then need to think through from a preclinical perspective, do you have the right data to meet what that jurisdiction requires? If there's an animal model, is it the appropriate animal model? If there are several, you need to think through what that may be. The disease that you're treating, is it being mimicked by that animal model? If there is no animal model, what do you, are there cell-based assays, whatever it may be. All of this needs to be thought through, in my mind, with the end in mind approach as well, because your patient population at the end may be larger than what your initial population is, but you do want to kind of work backwards from there as well. So what are the key fundamental symptoms that you want to, show that you're able to resolve or treat or mitigate with the therapy? Is it translatable to the human? So all of these things should be thought about before. So what are the non-clinical to clinical endpoints which could translate? You need to start being able to think through that. If it's a gene therapy, then the product that you're using from a CMC perspective, you want to use as close to the clinical product as possible in your earlier phase of development, because there is a financial component to that. There's similarities that, similarity studies, and comparability studies that you may need to do. I guess high level overview, that's kind of, where going around this wheel. From an organizational perspective, when you're bringing people in, depending on where you are, if you are thinking about, accelerating a path to the clinic, do you need to bring more medical people on? Are you at translation only for now? And then there's just a whole component around finances. And sometimes there is, people balk at the idea of what an upfront CMC cost is, but actually sometimes it makes sense to put that early investment in, so then it saves you money later down the line as well, depending on, what quality product you're putting in at which stage of development. I guess a high level overview, there's kind of lots of things to think about in this wheel. Yuri?
Yeah, I think you really hit on like some of the key topics. I think just to reference back though to something, Benit, that you mentioned earlier, is there is no way that like any individual or even any internal team is going to be able to have the pulse on all of these things globally. And so having then a network of experts that one can draw on to get these answers, and like just to use what you were sharing earlier, Benit, I mean, just like commercializing in each region is different, so is each regulatory agency. One cannot presume that they are the same. They are very different, and they are evolving too. They are constantly changing, despite efforts around standardization. And this is particularly important as we think about different modalities of treatment as agencies learn, and the need to bring regulatory agencies along, or in some cases learn together with them, which I've found for novel modalities is very common. And that allows an organization to kind of put forward their best thesis, but then also to help advance their ends while helping regulators create more predictable frameworks. And so that's one where, again, thinking through, Benit, as you mentioned, sometimes it requires an upfront investment that one might think of as a opportunity to save costs. I think another one, and this is around both preclinical, clinical success, as well as commercialization, is how important endpoint selection is. And not just your primary endpoints, even if you're in a disease where there's already a lot of consensus around those and they are at least solid or okay endpoints. How do we think about other endpoints that may serve different purposes, whether those purposes be commercial, demonstrating value, helping to even provide validation of an organization's platform? One may say, look, this may not be an endpoint that is particularly influential for a disease area, but how does that provide additional confidence, say, to investors that my platform is doing what people say it's going to do? And the ability to bring in really high and thoughtful biomarker programs is also absolutely essential whenever possible. And the companies that I see do the best at this are those that try to start doing that work from the very beginning, so then they can translate from their preclinical to their clinical and reduce that success. And not everyone has the benefit of being able to have a biomarker, but sometimes this requires real creative thinking. And also this is where, again, having that network and not presuming that the answer is necessarily going to lie within an organization, but that through stakeholder management and through a kind of robust scientific and medical lens, one can continue to bring that information together.
Yep. And so this thread has sort of come up in a bunch of different conversations so far, but you're talking about really the importance of getting the right team in place, leveraging a network of experts. What does that look like? What are some creative ways to think about team building, capability development, particularly in this environment now where talent is kind of scarce?
So I think, talent is scarce. I mean, there's been an explosion in, novel thinking. I mean, the strides we've taken, just over the past, decade or so, and, it's phenomenal. Not everybody can keep up either. So, it's not just a dearth of talent, but it's just having the people that are interested in that space as well. I think the other problem as well, more recently, is because, there was these funding challenges, some companies had to wind down, the company themselves or certain programs, people have lost their jobs. I think there is some uncertainty in people as well, with regard to, if I take this job, will it last forever? So there's just some of these things to be mindful of. But from a teaming perspective, I do think, we're moving forward now. I do think the corner has been turned. I do think if we can help bring in people, to the organization in key roles where there potentially could be deficits, I don't think that there's any shame in hiring external help, even if they're, on a contract basis, because you may need them for a short period of time. You may need them to train up the people that you have as well. So I do think we need to think about, I think we need to kind of think about how organizations do structure, their early development, and actually even the way through as the company grows overall.
Finding good people is really, really hard. And yet at the same time, I couldn't be more excited right now about the level of talent, I think, as Benit mentioned, and the flexibility that we currently have as different organizations hit different points. The opportunity to say, look, we don't necessarily need this role full time, but now there's so many skilled individuals who also bring in that network effects because they are also working in other areas across the globe. And so that actually, in some cases, I think can help the company have a broader reach for their programs. The most important thing, regardless of whether employed, fractional, completely outsourced, is how do you set up the team to be collaborative, and the focus is on solving the problem at hand, and doing so in a way that there are decision-making forums that really put the best of the program and the best of the company at heart. And I often find the way to do that is to really focus on bringing data to rigorously solve problems, and that the data is the answer. And so as much as possible, building that network can help to solve those human resource and human capital needs. But I think it's exciting because then you get to surround a team with experts, some who are part of the company and others who really have a breadth of experience, and they're kind of seeing firsthand how others are navigating and can bring that expertise as part of the company.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me because a lot of these more organizational components they seem obvious in a sense, but I guess why is that? Why are we not uniformly setting up this type of governance across all of our organizations? Where are we seeing potential pitfalls here?
I do think that, and Yuri mentioned this earlier, the need for agility, kind of outside the box thinking. I do think there is an element of traditional development, and I do think some of that still exists, in the traditional mold of how pharma works, and I think some of that has an implication in terms of this agile resource model, at least in my experience anyway. I do think it can never be a one shoe fits all. And I think, if you've gone down that large pharma role, where everything is set, kind of makes sense, but you have the resources to be able to kind of, throw people at doing different things and they can stay there in their own silo. But in biotechs, it's very agile. It's quick, it's usually a very lean team as well. And I think if you bring that traditional pharma mentality in, that's kind of where you will start to see some of that breakage. And that's kind of where I've seen it. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so many organizations run on annual processes, and there is a need for those. But as you just pointed out, hopefully development doesn't map itself to that process. Hopefully the process of development maps to the optimal process for developing that given compound and that program. So then again, this is another translational need, which is in how does the team help the organization develop a flexible model to say, look, we may need to examine resource needs at different intervals other than our annualized budget process. In fact, that is probably not the optimal planning process around those resource needs. And is there forums that don't have to be developed always ad hoc? And in some organizations where they're sufficiently small, that's not really that difficult. But as organizations scale, you do need to have those processes standardized because of the size of the organization to make that communication more efficient and effective. But maintaining, and this is where agility starts to go away, is as you scale, that ability to be agile starts to get unintentionally pushed out. And so there needs to be a very conscious effort to maintain it and find pathways where one can continue to be flexible while not grinding the organization to a halt. And that's a really tough balance to strike. And you need people who kind of seen that done well or seen it done really poorly and then learned from that and then figured out how to do it well to help bring that into the organizations they work with.
Well, right. And it's the balance of doing it fast versus doing it right. But I think doing it right doesn't always mean slow, but it does mean that we have a bit more of a thoughtful approach. We're not just kind of running in all directions. So I want to take a pause and see if we have any questions from our participants. While we're teeing those up, maybe I can kick off the Q&A with another question that I think we get pretty often from many of our clients, which is really around how can I shorten the development timeline and truncate it as much as possible?
I think it depends on the modality, and again, typical political answer, it depends. Everything you can do within reason. Now, Yuri made a point around biomarkers early and thinking outside of the box. If one of the requirements, let's say for an investor, is an early approval, you do have the accelerated approval pathway. You do, one way to think about it is there a biomarker that you can leverage, that you can utilize, which will then show clinical benefit in the future? Can you demonstrate that in your animal model? Are you able to translate that? So that would truncate your development timeline in terms of, getting it into the clinic, but then it is an accelerated approval, which then, you still need to generate the data long term eventually as well. But that's one of the ways. I think thinking about, where there's synergy amongst programs, amongst different work streams is extremely important as well. But that's kind of one of the main ones you can think about, truncating a development timeline.
Yep.
Yuri, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one where having a team that is able to enabling a team to pattern recognize what are areas where you can find those areas of truncation, as you mentioned, Benit, and also recognizing the ones where you don't, so you don't waste time to try and truncate things where you're never going to truncate that. And you just have to say, that's something that's immovable, we're going to plan around. But what are all the other things that we can plan around? There was one trial I did, for example, this was initially brought on by COVID, but we completed it this way, where we switched to a totally decentralized clinical trial platform initially people said, we don't think we can do this as totally decentralized. We ended up recruiting a 1,500 patient trial 5 months early because of the decentralized aspect. We had a much higher funnel and wider funnel. And initially the ClinOps team was concerned there's no way that we can accommodate that. And that was the rationale for why that wasn't movable. But we were able to figure that out. There are other aspects where one can even build in flexibility, for example, in earlier translational studies to say we're going to change cohort sizes as we learn about pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic data. So I think for each stage of development, having a team who can identify what are those areas that are potentially able to be refined is a approach, and then planning around those that are not able to be moved. But I think more and more as we're having pragmatic study designs, technology platforms that are allowing for really unique ways of trying to recruit patients and very quickly validate those patients so that you can move patients through your funnel are all really exciting tools.
So I think the thing that you just touched on there with just tech, living in a modern world, right, with AI and everything that's coming on board, and actually there is great potential with AI, actually. So you've got heterogeneous diseases. If you're looking for, some homogeneity, you could potentially leverage AI, to start building algorithms for you. You could potentially have AI look at, patient profiles for you as well, which could also then expedite enrollment and recruitment as well. So I do think, it's not just, I do think, that there's a lot of tech that we probably need to get our heads around. And to your point, bringing the right people at the right time that can actually help guide and advise you on this as well, right, Yuri? Because, there are so many, there's so many potentials, I guess, where we could, just with modern technology that, we can think through, if you want, and just with the AI and the modeling, and I think there's great value there, which we probably shouldn't discount. To your point, you said people didn't believe that decentralized trial would work, but then you've recruited early. So I think, thinking about things slightly differently and how things apply in other arenas outside of life sciences, thinking about them, how they could work within life sciences as well. I think that's one good way of being able to truncate timelines.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think part of this is having a team who has sufficient humility, like you mentioned earlier, Benit, to say either we don't know or this is something we're going to go out and test. And having that hypothesis data refinement model for everything, not just for the science itself, but for operations can really, really help the team identify those areas of opportunity. And I hope those are things that we bring also to the like regulatory discussions as well, where maybe over time, like there might be regulatory agencies who say, look, we need this, but then over time we bring them back data, show we're a good partner. And then that's going to actually lead to learnings of the regulatory agency, which may open things up in terms of what kind of data may be sufficient.
I think, I agree, and I think it's important. I just think that there is a lack of equipoise amongst regulatory agencies, though, which then just confounds matters and makes things confusing as well. So I think, it's kind of the elephant in the room. Which regulatory agency do you want to, meet the needs of first?
Yeah, that's a nice segue to one of the questions that we got, which is, can you comment on safety data the agency wants to see now versus 5 or 10 years ago? And I think more broadly, how is this changing as well beyond safety data?
I'll go first on that as well. So I think, from a gene therapy perspective, that there is a shift in terms of data that is required. So the FDA actually requires less long-term follow-up now for AAVs, whereas outside of the US, they still require 10, 15 years worth of data, so there is a shift already. But what was required before from the US, was 10, 15 years worth of follow-up data. That's now shifted to 25 years worth of data. I think for me, that's one thing. And Yuri, I guess, you've got more experience of the other novel modalities as well, especially even in digital, in how they differ.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the center, depends on the division too. I mean, I think that's the other challenge here is it's hard to come to kind of broad conclusions. And so as much as possible, like looking at those precedents and then having a real rationale, trying to understand the question point. So I've seen over a course of even like 3 different submissions to the same division that the division's position changes. And so that's where having that communication be robust. Sometimes there'll be openness, and sometimes, to Bennett's point, there is an openness, and one then has to make like a judgment call. But I also here do see that there are certain areas where if kind of an open, descriptive discussion with the different agencies is taken, one can find ways to then try and resolve those. But with new modalities, it's understandable that regulators are going to be skeptical until they start to see those decisions. And I think, Bennett's point around AAV and gene therapy is a key one.
All right, we have another really interesting question. So some animal models for certain diseases are not really good in translating or predicting human outcomes. How does the agency view this, and how does this limit development strategies?
I mean, I could go first since poor Bennett's been having to go first every single time. I'll mention this from a clinical perspective, and then there's like the regulatory perspective. From a clinical perspective, if you're working in a disease where there's really nice animal models, like, be grateful. There are plenty of diseases where there just are not good animal models. And ultimately, I think then the approach has to be less around translating and predicting human outcomes and more around just establishing a safety bar. And then the goal should be get into the clinic as soon as possible. Because ultimately, particularly in modalities where you don't even have homology between the therapeutic and the in the animals versus the patients, you just need to get into the organism that you actually care about. Now, the challenge is, do you also simultaneously have the ability to put together a data package that provides that clarity? One, so from an ethical perspective, everyone feels comfortable that we are meeting our obligation to human subjects. But then 2, what is the pathway? And I think this also highlights where different agencies around the globe have very different thoughts. And so there is an opportunity to take data from one region and then take it back to another region to unlock those regions. And so that's why, again, a expansive view needs to be taken.
So I agree. I think not limiting yourself to one region and not just, thinking about the globe as it should be, and then leveraging, what the regulatory hurdles limits are per region. And if you can generate human data, take that, human data package to the other jurisdictions you want to do. I agree with Yuri. I think, if you have a perfect animal model, be grateful. It's rare. I mean, the EAE model that's used for MS, it's the primary model, for CNS inflammatory, but it's not a perfect model for MS, but it's still utilized. So I do think, there's certain aspects of a model, from a symptom perspective that's worth thinking about, but then also think about, are there any in vitro cell-based assays you could do, cell lines, because in vitro data is utilized as well. But to Yuri's point, I try and get to the clinic as quickly as you can, possibly as well, but think differently with different jurisdictions.
All right, so I think this brings us to time. Before we wrap up, I want to thank Benit and Yuri for the insight, for the very engaging discussion. We'll be following up in the coming weeks with our next session, which will focus on preclinical and first-in-human milestones. If you have any questions or would like to connect offline, please feel free to reach out via LinkedIn or email. And thanks everybody for joining.